My name's Claire, and I'm 35 years old. I live in Chicago, where the winters are brutal, but the summers make you forget all about them. I've been with David for 7 years now. We met at a friend's wedding, back when I still believed in fairy tales and happy endings. He was 32 then, working as a graphic designer, with this boyish charm that made me feel like the most important person in the room. Now, at 39, he's still charming, but in a way that feels more like a habit than something genuine. David's the kind of guy who can talk to anyone about anything. At parties, he's always the center of attention, cracking jokes and telling stories that make everyone laugh. But at home, it's different. He's quiet, almost distant, like he's used up all his words on everyone else. I used to think it was sweet, how he saved his quiet moments for me. Now, it just feels like I'm getting the leftovers. We live in a small 2-bedroom apartment in Lincoln Park. It's cozy, with just enough space for the two of us and our cat, Mochi. David's studio takes up most of the second bedroom, filled with his art supplies and half-finished projects. I work as a marketing manager for a local tech company, which pays the bills but leaves me feeling empty most days. The cracks started showing about 2 years ago. It wasn't anything dramatic, just little things that added up over time. David would forget our plans, or show up late to dinner dates. He'd promise to help with chores around the apartment, only to get distracted by a new art project. At first, I made excuses for him. He's an artist, I'd tell myself. He's passionate. But passion doesn't pay the bills, and it doesn't make you feel less alone. I remember one night, I came home after a particularly grueling day at work. I'd been dealing with a difficult client all week, and I just wanted to vent. David was in his studio, headphones on, completely absorbed in his work. I stood in the doorway for a good 5 minutes before he noticed me. "Hey babe," he said, pulling off his headphones. "How was your day?" I started to tell him about the client, about how they'd changed their mind for the 3rd time that week, about how my boss had thrown me under the bus in the meeting. But before I could finish, David's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then back at me. "Sorry," he said. "It's the gallery. They want to know if I can finish the new piece by Friday." I felt the words die in my throat. "It's fine," I said, even though it wasn't. "Go ahead." He gave me a quick kiss on the cheek before turning back to his work. I stood there for a moment, watching him, before retreating to the living room. That's when I realized how lonely I felt, even when we were in the same room. The thing is, I know I'm not perfect. I can be stubborn, and I have a tendency to bottle things up until they explode. I've been trying to work on that, but it's hard when you feel like you're the only one putting in the effort. David's always been the laid-back one, the one who goes with the flow. But sometimes, I wish he'd fight for something, for us. It was around this time that I met Alex. He was a new hire at work, brought in to head up the sales team. From the moment I saw him, I knew he was different. He had this energy about him, this drive that was both intimidating and attractive. He was 38, with salt and pepper hair and a smile that could light up a room. Our first real conversation happened in the break room. I was making coffee, trying to shake off the remnants of a bad night's sleep, when he walked in. "Rough morning?" he asked, leaning against the counter. I laughed, a little self-consciously. "Is it that obvious?" He smiled, and I noticed the way his eyes crinkled at the corners. Only to someone who's had a few rough mornings themselves. We started talking, and before I knew it, 20 minutes had passed. He told me about his move from New York, about how he was still getting used to the slower pace of Chicago. I found myself opening up in a way I hadn't in years, telling him about my frustrations at work, about how I sometimes felt stuck. "You're too talented to feel stuck," he said, and there was something in his voice that made me believe him. After that, we started running into each other more often. He'd stop by my office to chat, or we'd grab coffee together in the afternoons. It was innocent at first, just two colleagues getting to know each other. But there was an undercurrent of something more, something I tried to ignore. David noticed the change in me. "You seem happier lately," he said one night over dinner. "Work going better?" I hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I guess it is." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That's good. I'm glad." I wanted to tell him about Alex, about how talking to him made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in years, but I didn't. Instead, I changed the subject, asking about his latest project. He launched into an explanation, and I nodded along, my mind elsewhere. The turning point came a few weeks later. Alex and I were working late on a presentation, and the office was quiet, except for the hum of the air conditioning. We were sitting close, our shoulders almost touching as we went over the slides. "You're amazing at this," he said, looking at me with an intensity that made my stomach flip. "Why haven't you moved up in the company yet?" I shrugged, trying to ignore the way my heart was racing. "I don't know. I guess I never really pushed for it." "You should," he said, his voice low. "You deserve more than this." There was a moment of silence, heavy with unspoken words. Then, before I could think better of it, I leaned in and kissed him. It was brief, just a brush of lips, but it sent a jolt through me. Alex pulled back, his eyes wide. "Claire." "I'm sorry," I said quickly, standing up. "I shouldn't have done that." He stood too, reaching for my hand. "Don't apologize. We need to think about this." I nodded, my mind racing. What had I done? I was married, for God's sake. But as I looked at Alex, at the way he was looking at me, I couldn't bring myself to regret it. That night, I lay in bed next to David, staring at the ceiling. He was asleep, his breathing steady and calm. I thought about the kiss, about the way Alex had looked at me. For the first time in years, I felt alive. But at what cost? The next few weeks were a blur of stolen moments and guilty glances. Alex and I didn't kiss again, but there was a tension between us that was impossible to ignore. We'd find reasons to be alone together, our conversations filled with double meanings and unspoken promises. David, for his part, seemed oblivious. He was busy with a new project, spending long hours in his studio. I told myself that was a good thing, that it gave me space to figure out what I wanted. But deep down, I knew I was just avoiding the inevitable. The breaking point came one Friday night. David had promised we'd go out to dinner, just the two of us, but when I got home, he was still in his studio, completely absorbed in his work. "David," I said, standing in the doorway, "we had plans." He looked up, startled. "Shit, I'm sorry. I lost track of time." I felt a surge of anger, hot and sudden. "You always lose track of time when it comes to me." He stood up, running a hand through his hair. "That's not fair. You know how important this project is." "Important to who?" I shot back. "Because it sure doesn't feel important to our marriage." He looked at me, his expression a mix of guilt and frustration. "Claire, I'm trying. You know I am." "Are you?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Because it feels like I'm the only one trying anymore." There was a long silence, filled with all the things we weren't saying. Then David sighed, running a hand over his face. "Maybe we need to talk about this. Really talk." I nodded, feeling a lump in my throat. "Maybe we do." But we didn't talk that night. Instead, I went to bed early, claiming a headache. David stayed up, working on his project. I lay there staring at the ceiling, thinking about Alex and the life I could have with him. It was tempting, so tempting, but at what cost? The next morning, I woke up to an empty bed. David had left early for a meeting with his gallery. I checked my phone and saw a text from Alex. "Thinking about you." I stared at the message, my heart racing. Then, before I could think better of it, I replied, "Meet me for coffee?" He responded almost immediately, "Name the place." I gave him the address of a small cafe near my apartment, one I knew David never went to. Then I got dressed, my hands shaking as I buttoned my shirt. I told myself this was just coffee, just two colleagues catching up. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. When I arrived at the cafe, Alex was already there, sitting at a corner table. He stood up when he saw me, his smile warm and inviting. "Hey," he said, pulling out a chair for me, "you look beautiful." I felt a flush of warmth at his words, but also a pang of guilt. "Thanks," I said, sitting down. "You look good too." We ordered coffee and made small talk, but there was an undercurrent of tension between us. Finally, Alex reached across the table and took my hand. "Claire," he said, his voice serious. "We need to talk about what's happening between us." I looked down at our joined hands, feeling a mix of excitement and dread. "I know. I don't want to be the other guy," he said, "but I also can't pretend I don't have feelings for you." I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. "I don't know what to do, Alex. I care about David, but you're not happy," he finished for me. "I can see it in your eyes every time you talk about him." I nodded, the tears spilling over. "I feel so lost. Alex squeezed my hand. You're not lost, Claire. You're just at a crossroads. And whatever you decide, I'll be here for you. I looked at him, at the sincerity in his eyes, and felt a surge of emotion. In that moment, I wanted nothing more than to lean across the table and kiss him. But I didn't. Instead, I pulled my hand away and stood up. I need to think, I said, my voice trembling. I need to figure out what I want. Alex nodded, his expression understanding. Take your time. I'll be here. I left the cafe, my mind racing. I knew I had a decision to make, one that would change everything. But as I walked home, I couldn't help but wonder if I was ready for the consequences. The walk home felt longer than usual, each step heavy with the weight of my thoughts. When I finally reached our apartment, David was there, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. He looked up when I walked in, his expression unreadable. Hey, he said. Where were you? I hesitated, then forced a smile. Just went for a walk. Needed some fresh air. He nodded, but I could tell he didn't quite believe me. There was a tension in the air, thick and uncomfortable. I wanted to say something, to break the silence, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I busied myself with making tea, my hands shaking as I filled the kettle. David watched me, his gaze heavy on my back. Claire, he said finally, we need to talk. I turned to face him, my heart pounding. About what? About us, he said, his voice steady. About where we're going. I felt a lump form in my throat. What do you mean? He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I'm not blind, Claire. I can see that you're unhappy, and I know I haven't been the best partner lately, but I want to fix this. I want to fix us. I stared at him, surprised by his words. This wasn't the David I was used to, the one who avoided difficult conversations. This was someone new, someone who seemed genuinely willing to try. I don't know if we can fix this, I said quietly. I don't know if I can. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of hurt and determination. We have to try, don't we? I didn't have an answer for that. Instead, I sat down at the table, my tea forgotten. For the first time in months, we talked, really talked. About our frustrations, our fears, our hopes. It was raw and painful, but also cathartic. By the time we finished, the sun had set, casting long shadows across the room. David reached across the table and took my hand. I love you, Claire, he said. I know I haven't shown it enough, but I do. And I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this work. I looked at him, at the man I had married, and felt a surge of emotion. Maybe we could fix this. Maybe we could find our way back to each other. But then my phone buzzed, and I saw Alex's name flash across the screen. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly silenced it. David noticed, of course. Who was that? He asked, his voice carefully neutral. No one, I said too quickly. Just work. He nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. The moment was broken. The fragile connection we had started to rebuild shattered. The next few weeks were a blur of tension and uncertainty. David tried, I'll give him that. He made an effort to be more present, to listen when I spoke, to show me he cared. But it felt forced, like he was trying to be someone he wasn't. Meanwhile, Alex was still there, a constant presence in my life. We didn't cross any more lines, but the attraction between us was undeniable. Every time we were together, I felt torn, pulled in two different directions. It all came to a head one rainy afternoon. I was at work, finishing up a report when Alex walked into my office. He closed the door behind him, his expression serious. Claire, he said, we need to talk. I felt a knot of anxiety in my stomach. About what? About us, he said, sitting down across from me. About what we're doing. I looked at him, at the intensity in his eyes, and felt my resolve waver. Alex, I know you're trying to work things out with David, he said, cutting me off, and I respect that. But I can't keep pretending that I don't have feelings for you. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. I don't know what to do. He reached across the desk and took my hand. You don't have to decide right now, but I need you to know that I'm here, that I care about you, and that I want to be with you. I looked at him, at the sincerity in his eyes, and felt a surge of emotion. In that moment, I wanted nothing more than to say yes, to throw caution to the wind and follow my heart. But then I thought of David, of the life we had built together. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. And despite everything, I still loved him. I need time, I said finally, my voice trembling. I need to figure out what I want. Alex nodded, his expression understanding. Take your time. I'll be here. I left work early that day, my mind racing. When I got home, David was there, waiting for me. He took one look at my face and knew something was wrong. "Claire," he said, "what's going on?" I took a deep breath, then let it all out. I told him about Alex, about the feelings I had been trying to ignore. It was the hardest thing I had ever done, but it was also a relief. David listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he sat down heavily on the couch, running a hand over his face. I knew something was going on, he said finally. But I didn't want to believe it. "I'm sorry," I said, tears streaming down my face. "I never meant to hurt you." He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of hurt and anger. "But you did, Claire, you did." We sat in silence for what felt like hours, the weight of my confession hanging heavy in the air. Finally, David stood up. "I need some time to think," he said. "I'm going to stay with a friend for a few days." I nodded, feeling numb. "Okay." He packed a bag and left, the sound of the door closing behind him echoing in the empty apartment. I sat there, alone, and let the tears come. The next few days were a blur of emotions. I went to work, but my heart wasn't in it. Alex tried to talk to me, but I couldn't face him. I needed time to think, to figure out what I really wanted. As the days turned into weeks, I started to see things more clearly. I realized how much I had taken David for granted, how much I had let my own dissatisfaction blind me to the good things in our relationship. I thought about all the times he had tried to connect with me, and how I had pushed him away. I also realized that my feelings for Alex were more about escape than anything real. He represented a fantasy, a way out of the problems I didn't want to face. But fantasies don't last, and they don't solve anything. When David and I finally sat down to talk again, I was ready to be honest. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," I said, "and I realize now how much I've hurt you. I was so focused on what I wasn't getting that I didn't see how much I was taking for granted." David nodded, his expression serious. "I've been thinking too, and I realize that I haven't been the partner you needed. I've been so focused on my work that I haven't been there for you the way I should have been." We talked for hours, about our hopes and fears, about the things we had done wrong and the things we wanted to do better. In the end, we both realized that while we still loved each other, we had grown apart in ways that couldn't be fixed. "We've both made mistakes," David said finally, "but I think the biggest mistake would be to keep trying to force something that isn't working." I nodded, tears streaming down my face. "I think you're right." We decided to separate, to give each other the space to grow and heal. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when I wanted to take it all back. But deep down, I knew it was the right thing to do. In the months that followed, I threw myself into therapy and self-improvement. I started journaling, meditating, and reconnecting with old friends. I also started volunteering at a local shelter, which gave me a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. David and I stayed in touch, checking in with each other from time to time. It was hard at first, but over time, we found a new rhythm. We weren't husband and wife anymore, but we were still friends, still connected by the love and history we shared. As for Alex, I kept my distance. I realized that he had been a symptom of my unhappiness, not the solution. I needed to find my own way to figure out who I was and what I wanted, without relying on someone else to fill the void. Looking back, I realize how close I came to losing myself. But in the end, I found my way back. It wasn't the happy ending I had imagined, but it was real. And sometimes, real is enough.